As your storytelling reaches this advanced stage, something even more refined begins to emerge. The realization that attention is not just captured or maintained, it is transferred, meaning the emotional energy you embed into the narrative is gradually adopted by the viewer, shaping not only how they feel during the video, but how they think about it afterward. And this transfer is what ultimately determines whether your story fades away or continues to live inside the audience's theme. Because a powerful story does not end when the visuals stop. It continues as a lingering thought, a quiet emotion, or a perspective that subtly alters how the viewer sees their own reality. At this level, your control over emotional rhythm becomes your greatest asset, because you are no longer just guiding events, you are guiding perception, deciding not only what the audience sees, but how they interpret it, and this requires a deep awareness of timing, of knowing exactly when to reveal, when to pause, and when to let a moment sit in silence so that its weight can fully register. Because sometimes the most impactful storytelling happens in what is not said, in the space between words where the audience fills in the meaning themselves. This is where minimalism begins to outperform complexity, because once the foundation of your narrative is strong, you no longer need to over-explain or over-illustrate. You can trust the audience to understand, to interpret, to connect. And this trust creates a more intimate experience, where the viewer feels respected rather than directed, involved rather than instructed. And as this intimacy deepens, the boundary between creator and audience starts to blur, because the story begins to feel less like something being presented and more like something being shared, almost like a conversation rather than a performance. And this shift is incredibly powerful, because people engage more deeply with what feels personal and authentic than with what feels polished and distant. However, maintaining this authenticity requires consistency, not just in tone but in intention. Because if your narrative suddenly shifts into something that feels artificial or disconnected from its earlier emotional grounding, the illusion breaks, and once that connection is disrupted, it is extremely difficult to restore within the same experience. This is why alignment is crucial. Alignment between your message, your tone, your pacing, and your emotional direction. Because when all these elements move together in harmony, the storytelling feels seamless, almost effortless, even though it is carefully constructed beneath the surface. As you move closer to the final stages, the audience's expectations reach their peak, not in terms of plot, but in terms of meaning, because by now they are not just asking what will happen, they are asking what it all means, what they are supposed to take away from the experience. And this is where your role as a storyteller subtly shifts into that of an interpreter, someone who helps translate events into insight without making it feel forced or overly explicit. One of the most effective ways to deliver this insight is through reflection, not as a separate section, but as a natural extension of the narrative, where the story itself begins to reveal its own meaning, allowing the audience to arrive at conclusions organically rather than being directly told what to think. This approach not only feels more satisfying, but it also increases retention and shareability, because people are more likely to remember and share ideas they feel they discovered themselves, even if those discoveries were gently guided by your storytelling. At the same time, you must remain aware of emotional saturation, because if the intensity remains too high for too long, the audience can become desensitized, reducing the impact of your final moments. So it is often effective to slightly lower the intensity just before the climax, creating contrast that makes the final peak feel more powerful. This contrast acts like a reset for the viewer's emotional state, allowing them to fully experience the impact of the resolution without being overwhelmed or fatigued, and it also creates a sense of pacing that feels natural and balanced. Then comes the moment where everything must align, where your narrative, your emotion, and your message converge into a single, cohesive experience. And this moment does not need to be loud or dramatic to be powerful. It simply needs to feel true, because authenticity amplifies impact more than any external effect ever could. And when this moment lands correctly, the audience experiences a sense of clarity, not necessarily because every question has been answered, but because the emotional journey feels complete, because the story has delivered on its promise in a way that feels meaningful and satisfying. But even as the story concludes, your work as a storyteller is not entirely finished, because the final impression you leave will determine how the audience interacts with your content after it ends. Whether they simply move on, or whether they pause, reflect, and feel compelled to engage further. This is where subtle calls to reflection become powerful, not direct instructions to like or share, but moments that invite thought, that encourage the viewer to connect the story to their own experiences, because when people see themselves in your narrative, engagement becomes a natural response rather than a forced action. And this kind of engagement is far more valuable, because it is driven by genuine connection rather than surface-level interaction, leading to deeper comments, more meaningful shares, and a stronger overall impact. As you step back and look at the entire storytelling process, you begin to see that every element, from the opening hook to the final line, is interconnected, each part influencing the next, creating a continuous flow that either strengthens or weakens the overall experience depending on how well it is executed. This interconnectedness is what makes storytelling both challenging and rewarding, because success is not determined by a single moment, but by the cumulative effect of countless small decisions, each contributing to the final result. And once you fully understand this, once you begin to think not in terms of isolated scenes but in terms of complete experiences, your approach to storytelling changes fundamentally, shifting from simply creating content to crafting journeys that people willingly follow from beginning to end. Because in the end, the true measure of a storytelling video is not just how many views it receives, but how deeply it resonates, how long it stays in the viewer's mind, and how strongly it compels them to pass it on. And when you achieve that level of resonance, you are no longer just telling stories, you are creating something that people carry with them, something that becomes part of their own narrative long after your video has ended.